The emergency beacon cut through the peaceful hum of the galactic medical station Zephyr like a plasma blade through silk. Chief Medical Officer Kethvar's 4 eyes snapped to attention as the crimson alert flooded his sterile workspace, casting ominous red shadows across the pristine walls of his office. The holographic displays around him immediately shifted from routine patient charts to emergency protocols, each screen pulsing with urgent data streams. Medical emergency on mining platform Delta 7, the automated system announced in its melodic Xentorian dialect, though today the usually soothing voice seemed to carry an undertone of dread. Species, unknown. Classification, Deathworlder. Severe trauma. Requesting immediate assistance. ETA, 47 standard minutes. Kethvar's tentacles coiled nervously around his chair's armrests, leaving small stress marks in the biometal surface. The word Deathworlder hung in the air like a curse, making even the station's atmospheric recycler seem to whisper with unease. In his 40 cycles of service across 3 galactic sectors, he treated species that most medics wouldn't dare approach. Kragans with their acidic blood that could eat through hull plating, Borthak whose crystalline bones could shatter into deadly projectiles if handled improperly, and even the gaseous nebulites whose very presence could suffocate oxygen-breathing species. But a Deathworlder? Those were the stuff of legends whispered in medical conferences and theoretical xenobiology texts, beings from worlds so utterly hostile that they'd evolved into living weapons just to survive their first breath. Planets where the atmosphere itself was toxic, where predators hunted in packs with intelligence rivaling spacefaring civilizations, where the weather patterns could level cities and the plant life could digest metal. Nurse Yilma, prep emergency bay 3 immediately, he called to his assistant, a delicate Floran whose flower-like petals were already shifting from their usual soft pink to an anxious deep purple. Her species' chromatophoric responses were as reliable as any emotion scanner, and right now she was broadcasting pure terror. And, activate the containment protocols. Full quarantine setup. Sir, Yilma's voice trembled like wind through autumn leaves, her petals now cycling through colors that indicated she was fighting every evolutionary instinct to flee. Are you certain we should attempt treatment? The safety protocols for Deathworlder contact recommend immediate transfer to specialized military medical facilities. The nearest one is only 6 standard days away. 6 days this being doesn't have, Kethvar interrupted, pulling up the preliminary data streaming from the transport vessel. What he saw made his chromatophores flash in involuntary alarm patterns. Internal bleeding, massive blunt force trauma, possible spinal damage, injuries that would have killed most species instantly. Yet somehow, impossibly, the creature's vital signs were not just stable but strong. Besides, we took an oath, Yilma. He stood, his full 3-meter height casting long shadows as the emergency lighting continued to pulse. Around the station, he could hear the subtle shift in activity as other medical staff became aware of what was incoming. Conversations dropped to whispers, footsteps quickened, and he caught glimpses of various species' fear responses, chittering from the insectoid Vex Ti, nervous humming from the crystalline shard singers, and the distinctive ozone smell that plasma bearers emitted when stressed. All life, no matter how terrifying, Kethvar reminded his assistant, though his own voice betrayed the uncertainty that was making his secondary hearts beat in rapid, staccato rhythms. He moved toward the preparation chamber, each step measured and deliberate despite the chaos of thoughts swirling in his mind. As the station's medical bay transformed itself into a fortress of healing and containment, Kethvar couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to encounter something that would forever change their understanding of what it meant to be alive in this dangerous galaxy. The transport ship's doors hissed open with a mechanical sigh that seemed to echo through the entire medical bay, releasing a wave of heated air that made every environmental system on the station adjust with audible strain. 2 figures in heavy-duty environmental suits moved with practiced precision, their movements careful and deliberate as they maneuvered an industrial-grade stretcher through the airlock. The suits themselves were scorched and dented, clear evidence of whatever hell they'd just escaped from. On the stretcher lay something that made Kethvar's chromatophores flash in involuntary alarm patterns, cycling through colors his species reserved for apex predator encounters. The being was roughly humanoid in structure, but that was where any similarity to known bipedal species ended. It was built like a living siege engine. Impossibly broad shoulders that strained against the restraint straps, dense muscle mass that created valleys and ridges across its torso, and skin that looked like it had been forged in the fires of a war zone. Scars crisscrossed the visible flesh in complex patterns, each one telling a story of survival against odds that would have ended most species. "Human," announced Captain Zex Tull, a gruff Hammerian whose reinforced shell bore the accumulated scars of 100 mining accidents across his 40-year career. His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen the galaxy's worst industrial disasters and lived to tell about it. "Found him 3 levels down in a collapsed tunnel after the seismic event. Took a primary support beam, solid dura steel, mind you, straight to the torso. Been unconscious for 2 standard hours, but his vital signs." He paused, shaking his massive head. "Doc, I've seen mining equipment with weaker life signs." Kethvar approached with the calculated caution of a xenobiologist studying a newly discovered apex predator, his medical scanners emerging from his utility belt with practiced movements. As the devices began their preliminary analysis, the readings that flooded his visual display were not just unusual, they were completely impossible according to everything he understood about carbon-based biology. The creature's internal temperature was a scorching 310.15 Kelvin, hot enough to literally cook the blood of most galactic species. Its atmospheric requirements showed a need for an oxygen-nitrogen mixture that would be acutely toxic to over 60% of known sapient life forms, with trace gases that several species would classify as industrial solvents. The bone density readings made his scanners recalibrate twice, displaying numbers typically associated with metallic compounds rather than organic calcium structures. "By the void," whispered Yilma, her delicate petals now cycling through pure white, a color her species only displayed when confronting imminent death. Her bioluminescent patches were pulsing in rapid, panicked patterns. "Look at those cardiovascular readings, Doctor. The pressure differentials alone should have caused massive system failure. And the muscular density, how is it still alive? How is anything that dense even capable of movement?" As if summoned by her words, the human stirred with a movement that sent subtle tremors through the medical bay's deck plating. Suddenly, 2 blue-green orbs snapped open, and Kethvar found himself staring into eyes that seemed to contain the accumulated fury of a hostile universe. They moved with terrifying precision, scanning the room with the methodical assessment of a predator evaluating threats and escape routes. The intelligence behind those eyes was unmistakably sapient, but it carried an edge of calculated violence that made every evolutionary alarm in Kethvar's nervous system scream at maximum volume. When those alien eyes locked onto Kethvar's 4 optical sensors, the doctor felt every survival instinct his species had developed over millions of years of evolution join in a unified chorus: flee, hide, submit, anything but remain in the direct attention of this walking catastrophe. "Where am I?" the human asked, and its voice was a low, rumbling bass that seemed to vibrate through the deck plating and into the very bones of everyone present. The sound carried harmonics that spoke of barely contained power, like the warning growl of geological forces preparing to reshape continents. "Easy, warrior," Kethvar said, forcing his voice to remain steady despite his trembling tentacles. "You're in the medical bay of Station Zephyr. I'm Dr. Kethvar. What is your designation?" The human tried to sit up, winced, then settled back with a grimace that revealed disturbingly sharp teeth. "Marcus Rodriguez, mining engineer, platform Delta 7. He looked around the sterile bay with those unsettling eyes. "Guess that beam got me good, huh?" "You have significant internal trauma," Kethvar confirmed, his scanners still providing readings that defied medical logic. "We need to operate immediately, but first. I must ask. Your species is unknown to our medical databases. What should we know about human physiology?" Marcus managed a weak laugh that somehow sounded more dangerous than most species' war cries. "Doc, I appreciate the help, but I should warn you, human biology is pretty intense. We're from a Class 12 Deathworld. Our blood alone can cause panic among most species. Yilma's petals turned an even paler shade. Your blood. High iron content, rapid coagulation factors, aggressive healing responses, Marcus explained, his breathing becoming more labored. Plus we run hot, literally. Our optimal body temperature would cook most aliens I've met. Kethvar exchanged glances with his assistant. Every instinct told him to transfer this patient to a specialized Deathworld facility, but the nearest one was 6 standard days away. This human, this Marcus, would be dead in hours without intervention. We'll manage, Kethvar decided. Prep for surgery. The operating theater had been transformed into something resembling a military containment facility rather than a medical suite. All non-essential personnel had been evacuated to a safe distance of 3 decks away, leaving only the core surgical team. Emergency blast shields had been activated around the theater's periphery, and the atmospheric recycling system had been switched to full containment mode with emergency purge protocols standing by. Only Kethvar, Yilma, and surgical assistant Nexko, a stoic lithoid whose silicon carbide constitution made him theoretically the most resistant to whatever unknown horrors human physiology might unleash, remained in the sterile chamber. The anesthetic phase alone had been a revelation in the terrifying efficiency of human biology. What should have been a routine sedation procedure had required enough pharmaceutical agents to render unconscious an entire Kragan heavy lifter, roughly equivalent to a small armored vehicle. The human's metabolic processes had consumed the initial doses so rapidly that the automated systems had flagged potential equipment malfunction before realizing they were simply witnessing an unprecedented rate of drug metabolism. Beginning initial incision on the primary trauma site, Kethvar announced to the recording systems, his voice carefully controlled despite the tremor in his tentacles. The surgical laser hummed to life, its beam calibrated for standard organic tissue penetration based on 40 years of successful procedures across dozens of species. Commencing standard exploratory surgery to assess internal damage. The laser touched the human skin, and nothing happened. The coherent light beam, designed to slice through organic matter with surgical precision, simply dispersed harmlessly across the surface of Marcus's torso like sunlight hitting armored plating. The human skin didn't even show evidence of thermal heating. Impossible, Nexko rumbled, his mineral voice creating harmonic resonances in the surgical chamber's atmosphere. The lithoid's rock-based physiology had evolved to process geological data with computer-like precision, and what he was observing defied every classification system his species had developed over millions of years of evolution. The cellular density readings are extraordinary, but this is beyond extraordinary. Doctor, it's like trying to cut through military-grade composite armor plating. His skin has the structural integrity of manufactured hull materials. Kethvar stared at his instruments, then at the completely undamaged human lying before him. Every medical procedure, every surgical technique he had learned over 4 decades of practice, had just become potentially useless. He adjusted the laser's intensity settings, moving through progressively more powerful configurations designed for emergency amputations and trauma surgery on armored species. Still nothing. Increasing power to military-grade settings, he announced grimly, knowing that what he was about to attempt should never be necessary in a medical context. The lasers hummed deep into a threatening growl as its energy output increased to levels typically reserved for battlefield surgery on combat-enhanced soldiers or cutting through damaged hull plating during rescue operations. Finally, after reaching intensity levels that could have carved through starship armor, Kethvar managed to breach the human skin. What happened next would haunt his dreams for the rest of his natural life, replay in his nightmares until his species' final hibernation cycle, and fundamentally alter his understanding of what it meant for something to be alive in this hostile galaxy. Blood, not the pale, thin, almost transparent fluid that coursed through most civilized species, but a rich, dark crimson tide that seemed to pulse with its own internal energy, began to flow from the incision. But as soon as the life-giving liquid made contact with the surgical chamber's atmosphere, something that violated every principle of biology, chemistry, and physics that Kethvar understood began to occur. The blood began to congeal, not with the slow, gradual process that characterized normal organic clotting responses, but instantly, forming complex fibrous networks that sealed the wound almost as quickly as Kethvar could create it. "This is impossible," Kethvar whispered, his voice barely audible over the increasingly frantic hum of medical equipment that was struggling to process readings beyond their design parameters. The surgical field had transformed into something that resembled a battlefield between cutting-edge medical technology and the most terrifyingly efficient biological systems he had ever encountered. Every instrument in his tentacles felt inadequate, every procedure he had mastered over 4 decades suddenly rendered obsolete by the sheer impossibility of what he was witnessing. The human's blood wasn't just clotting, it was performing active reconstruction work at the cellular level. Advanced bioscanners revealed microscopic structures that defied classification, tiny protein complexes that worked with the coordinated precision of engineering teams, rebuilding damaged tissue faster than most species could even register injury. It was as if Marcus Rodriguez carried within his veins an entire medical facility operating at the molecular level. Nexko leaned closer, his massive rocky frame casting shadows across the surgical table, his mineral-based sensory organs processing data streams that his species typically reserved for analyzing geological formations and tectonic stability. "Look at the platelet activity, Doctor. These aren't just clotting factors responding to trauma, they're behaving like microscopic construction crews with predetermined architectural blueprints. The fibrin networks are forming load-bearing structures. This blood contains what can only be described as biological nanomachinery." The lithoid's voice carried undertones of what his species considered profound philosophical disturbance. In their geological worldview, such rapid reconstruction was associated with catastrophic planetary events. Volcanic rebuilding, continental reformation, the kind of processes that reshaped worlds over geological epochs, not surgical seconds. The blood had formed what could only be described as living scaffolding, creating temporary patches over the wounds while deeper layers of tissue began regenerating at rates visible to the naked eye. Muscle fibers were literally rewiring themselves around the surgical site, blood vessels were rerouting with the efficiency of adaptive traffic management systems, and the cellular regeneration was producing heat signatures that made the entire operating theater's environmental systems work overtime. Steam rose from Marcus's body as his metabolic processes shifted into what appeared to be combat mode, his internal temperature climbing to levels that would have killed most species through hyperthermia alone. The surgical chamber's atmosphere became thick and humid, creating an environment that felt more like standing inside a living engine than performing delicate medical procedures. "Doctor," Yilmaz's voice cracked like breaking crystal, her entire plant-based biology recoiling from the metabolic violence occurring before them, "his internal temperature is rising beyond safe parameters for the anesthetic compounds. The pharmaceutical agents are being metabolized faster than our delivery systems can compensate. According to these readings, he should be regaining consciousness in approximately 90 seconds, and when he does." As if her words had summoned the inevitable, Marcus's eyes snapped open with the sudden precision of a predator emerging from ambush. His pupils dilated rapidly as they adjusted to the surgical lighting, but rather than the confused disorientation typical of patients emerging from anesthesia, his gaze immediately focused with laser-like intensity on his surroundings. The human was instantly, completely, and terrifyingly alert. His hand shot up with the fluid speed of a striking viper, grasping Kethvar's primary surgical tentacle with enough force that the doctor's exoskeleton began to crack under the pressure. The grip was precise, controlled, and absolutely inescapable, not the random flailing of a disoriented patient, but the calculated restraint of someone who understood exactly how much force was required to immobilize without immediately killing. "Doc," Marcus said, his voice strained but completely conscious, cutting through the chaos of alarms and equipment failures with unsettling clarity, "you need to stop cutting and start patching. Human healing works differently than whatever you're used to. We don't need perfect surgery, we need fast surgery and battlefield medicine. Our bodies will handle the precision work. What we need from you is damage control and resource support." Kethvar stared down at the human, whose grip was slowly but steadily increasing pressure on his wrist assembly, and realized with crystalline clarity that he was looking at evolution's perfect expression of survival optimization. Not just intelligent, not just physically superior, but capable of healing from injuries that would represent certain death for most species, while remaining conscious and tactical throughout the entire process. As Kethvar worked with shaking tentacles to complete the surgery using Marcus's guidance, the human began explaining the horrifying reality of Deathworld evolution. Earth isn't just hostile, Marcus said, remaining conscious despite enough anesthetic to kill a Vorthack. It's actively trying to murder everything on it. Predators with jaws that can snap steel, diseases that adapt faster than we can cure them, weather that can flash freeze or cook you alive, and that's just Tuesday. Yilma had retreated to the far corner of the surgical suite, her petals now a color that roughly translated to existential terror. How do you sleep at night? With one eye open, Marcus replied with that disturbing human expression that might have been humor. Doc, you're doing great, but you need to understand, this injury. On Earth, this would be a bad day at work, not a medical emergency. We don't have medical stations every few light hours. We had to evolve to be our own hospitals. Kethvar paused in his suturing, finally understanding the true horror of what he was treating. This wasn't just a tough species, this was a being from a world so brutal that its inhabitants had become walking medical miracles just to survive childhood. The clotting, Nexko said slowly, it's not just for healing. It's to prevent predators from tracking blood trails. Smart rock guy, Marcus nodded approvingly. Nothing says easy prey like a blood trail leading to your hiding spot. Plus, rapid clotting means we can keep fighting even with wounds that would drop most species. As if to demonstrate, Marcus flexed his torso, and Kethvar watched in amazement as the surgical site held perfectly, the human's biological systems already treating the foreign sutures as temporary scaffolding. Your species, Kethvar said quietly, you're not just survivors. You're living weapons. Marcus's expression grew serious. No, document. We're living proof that life finds a way. We just happen to evolve in hell. 3 standard hours later, Marcus Rodriguez sat up in the recovery bay, his injuries healing at a rate that defied everything Kethvar thought he knew about medicine. The human was already requesting to be discharged, something that would have been laughable for any other species with similar trauma. I've sent a full report to the Galactic Medical Council, Kethvar said, reviewing his notes with still trembling tentacles. They're going to want to study your species' healing factors. Marcus shrugged, a gesture that should have torn his surgical sites but didn't even strain them. Good luck with that. We've been trying to figure ourselves out for millennia. Best advice I can give is this, if you ever encounter more humans, don't panic. We're not monsters, we're just thorough. As the human prepared to leave, Yilma finally approached, her petals a cautious green. Marcus, your planet. Earth. How do you find joy in such a place? Marcus smiled. A genuine expression that somehow made him look less predatory and more alive. Because when you live in hell, Doc, you learn to appreciate every moment you're not dying. Every sunset, every meal, every friend becomes precious because you know how easily it can all disappear. He stood, movements fluid despite his recent surgery, and extended his hand to Kethvar. Thanks for not giving up on me, document. Most species would have. Kethvar hesitantly extended a tentacle, which Marcus shook gently, mindful of his strength. It was educational. As Marcus walked toward the exit, his repaired environmental suit gleaming under the station lights, he paused at the door. Oh, and Doc. If you ever want to really understand humans, remember this, we don't just survive the impossible. We make friends with it, we laugh at it, and then we invite it over for dinner. The door closed, leaving 3 aliens staring after the most dangerous patient they'd ever successfully treated. Kethvar looked down at his notes, at readings that shouldn't exist, at medical procedures that defied logic, and realized that somewhere in the galaxy was an entire planet full of beings like Marcus Rodriguez. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, for the first time in his career, he found himself curious about what other impossible species might need medical care. After all, he'd taken an oath, all life, no matter how terrifying. And sometimes, the terrifying ones were the most worth saving. The end.